The lace was scratching my skin, 1,000 tiny teeth reminding me that I was encased in a $5,000 lie. Behind these heavy oak doors, 200 people were waiting for a miracle. They were waiting for the culmination of a 15-year fairy tale, the college sweethearts, the perfect couple, the union everyone said was written in the stars. But as I stood there, clutching a bouquet of white lilies that smelled more like a funeral than a wedding, my phone vibrated in the hidden pocket of my dress. One message. No sender name. Just a video file titled, "What He Does on Business Trips." Have you ever felt your soul leave your body while your heart kept beating? In 30 seconds, those doors are supposed to open. In 30 seconds, I am supposed to walk toward the man I've loved since I was 19. But the woman standing here now isn't the girl he spent 15 years grooming. She is someone else. And by the time we reach the altar, the man waiting for me won't just be losing a bride. He'll be losing his entire world. Before I tell you why I didn't turn and run, I need you to understand how he built this cage. Because to understand the betrayal, you have to see the beauty of the lie. This is a story about the masks we wear for the people we love and the price we pay when those masks finally slip. If you've ever felt like the person sleeping next to you was a stranger, or if you believe that justice should always have the final word, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to Kin Justice Chronicles right now and hit that notification bell. We are diving into a 15-year web of deception, and you won't want to miss a single second of how this empire falls. 15 years. That's 5,475 days of waking up to a man I thought I knew better than I knew myself. Julian was the kind of man people described as solid. He was the architect of our lives, both literally and figuratively. He loved order, he loved legacy, and God, did he love me. We met in the rain outside a lecture hall in 2011. He offered me his umbrella, and he never really stopped shielding me from the world after that. Our world was a curated masterpiece, a renovated Victorian in the suburbs, a golden retriever named Silas, and a social circle that looked at us as the gold standard for relationships. Julian was a partner at a top-tier architectural firm. His business trips were the pride of our household. He was designing skylines in cities I'd only seen on postcards, or so I thought. He was the man who remembered the anniversary of our first coffee date. He was the man who spent 3 years planning this wedding down to the vintage of the champagne. But as we settle into this story, I want you to look closely at the corners of our perfect house, because that's where the shadows were hiding. The world we lived in was built on a foundation of little omissions. It started 3 years ago with a small silver key on his keychain that didn't fit any door in our house. When I asked about it, he laughed, that deep, reassuring laugh that usually made my worries melt, and said it was for a filing cabinet at the office. Then there was the Dubai project. For 18 months, Julian was gone 10 days out of every month. He'd come home smelling of expensive sandalwood and jet lag, his suitcases packed with gifts that felt more like guilt payments than souvenirs. In this world of high society galas and power couple brunches, no one questioned Julian. To question him was to question the very idea of stability. I was Sarah Vance, the woman who had it all. But beneath the silk blouses and the organized pantry, I was starting to notice the silence. Julian wasn't just working on skylines, he was building a fortress, and I was the only one who didn't realize I was being locked out. I remember the way the light hit the engagement ring he designed himself. He told me the diamond represented our past, present, and future, a continuous, unbreakable loop. Looking back, I realized it wasn't a loop, it was a noose. We spent our 20s building a life that was so beautiful, it was blinding. We bought the forever home before we even had the forever rings. Julian handled the finances, the investments, the legalities. He said he wanted me to be free to pursue my art, to stay soft while he dealt with the hard world. It felt like protection then. Now it feels like erasure. By the time our wedding morning arrived, the architecture of the lie was complete. I was a woman with no access to her own bank accounts, living in a house owned by a man I realized I hadn't truly looked at in years. I had been so busy admiring the skyline he was building that I never noticed he was digging a grave right beneath my feet. As the organ began to swell with the opening notes of the processional, I realized that for 15 years, I hadn't been his partner. I had been his alibi. Take a moment to comment below. Do you think Sarah should have walked away then, or was she right to wait for the altar? I'll be responding to your theories throughout the premiere. The first real crack in the porcelain didn't happen with a shout or a dramatic discovery. It happened with a whisper and a silver key. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 years before the wedding march would ever play, and the house was filled with the smell of the rosemary chicken I had spent 2 hours preparing. Julian was in the shower, the steam rolling out from under the door, and I was moving his blazer to the coat rack when I felt it. A small, sharp weight in the pocket. It was a key. But not like the ones for our house or the cars. It was a flat industrial silver key with a serial number stamped on the side, 402. When I asked about it later over dinner, he didn't even blink. He just reached out, squeezed my hand, and told me it was for a high-security filing cabinet at the firm. He said it with such a gentle smile, such absolute conviction, that I felt ashamed for even noticing. That was Julian's greatest talent. He made your intuition feel like an insult to his character. He spent the next 3 years using that talent to build a second world, brick by brick, while I was busy decorating the first. I started to notice the Dubai project taking up more of his time, the 10-day trips becoming 12, then 14. He would return with his eyes tired and his skin smelling of a perfume I didn't recognize, but he always had a gift for me, a diamond tennis bracelet, a designer handbag, a vintage watch. Realize now, those weren't gifts. They were hush money for a crime I hadn't even realized was being committed. The silence in our home began to grow, a thick, heavy thing that lived in the hallways between his trips. I started to realize that for 15 years, I had been living in a curated exhibit. Julian curated my friends, my schedule, even the way I saw our future. He insisted on handling all the stressful things, the mortgages, the offshore investments he claimed were for our retirement, the legal paperwork for the house. He told me I was the artist, the soul of the family, and that he was the shield. But a shield can very easily become a wall. One afternoon, while Julian was supposedly in the air somewhere over the Atlantic, I found a receipt in the back of a drawer in his home office. It wasn't for a hotel in Dubai. It was for a dry cleaner in a suburb only 40 minutes away from our house, a place he had no reason to ever visit. The receipt was for a child's winter coat and a woman's silk blouse. My heart did a strange, cold stutter in my chest, but I pushed it down. I told myself it was a mistake, or perhaps a charitable donation he hadn't mentioned. That is the tragedy of a long-term lie. You become a co-conspirator in your own deception because the truth is too heavy to carry. I decided to drive to that suburb. I told myself I was just going for the scenery, but my hands were shaking on the steering wheel the entire time. I found the dry cleaners, and across the street, I saw a small, unassuming storage facility. The sign out front had the same logo I had seen on that silver key years ago. My feet moved before my brain could stop them. I walked into the front office, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I told the clerk I had lost my unit number, but had my key. I held out the silver key, number 402, and waited for the world to end. He didn't ask for ID. He just looked at the key and told me I was in Building B. When I opened the door to Unit 402, I expected to find old blueprints or office furniture. Instead, I found a life. There were boxes of children's toys, a crib, and a photo album sitting on top of a small wooden table. I opened the album, and the air left the room. It was Julian, not the Julian who wore tailored suits and discussed architecture, but a Julian in a t-shirt and jeans, holding a toddler on his lap. Next to him was a woman with dark hair and a tired, happy smile. The photos were dated over the last 5 years. 5 years of birthday parties, 5 years of Christmas mornings, 5 years of business trips that were actually just a 40-minute drive away. I sat on a box of baby clothes in that cold, dark unit and felt 15 years of my life dissolve into ash. Every I love you, every anniversary dinner, every plan we had made for our own children, it was all a performance. I wasn't his wife-to-be. I was his primary residence, his respectable front, the woman who kept his home pristine while he lived his real life in the shadows. He had used my credit, my trust, and my time to fund a secret family. I looked at the little girl in the photos, noticed the way she had Julian's eyes and his stubborn chin, and I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to lean against the corrugated metal wall. He had been building a skyline, all right, but he was living in the basement of a different house entirely. I didn't cry. The betrayal was too large for tears. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. Julian loved architecture because he loved control. He loved the way he could design a space to look exactly how he wanted it to look from the outside. But he had forgotten that every structure has a breaking point. I took the album, I took the receipts I found tucked in the back of a folder, and I locked the door to Unit 402. I drove home in a trance, the silver key feeling like a hot coal in my pocket. He was due back from his trip the next morning, and for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't going to be waiting at the door with a smile. I was going to be waiting with a plan. As I sat in our beautiful, hollow Victorian that night, watching the sun set over the garden he hired professionals to maintain, I realized that the man I loved never existed. He was a character created by a master manipulator. And if he wanted a performance, I was going to give him the greatest show of his life. I spent the night meticulously going through his digital files, finding the trust funds he had set up using my inheritance money, the money my grandmother had left me that he invested for our future. He had funneled it all into a life I wasn't allowed to see. The rage I felt was quiet, a steady hum in my blood. I knew I couldn't just leave. If I left now, he would spin the story, use his connections and his charm to make me look like the unstable one, and I would walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back. No, Julian had spent 15 years building this trap, and I was going to make sure he was the one who got caught in it. I would wait. I would wait for the one day when everyone he cared about was in one room. I would wait for the day he thought was his final victory. I would wait for the wedding. This is the moment where the perfect bride becomes the perfect hunter. If you're feeling the weight of this betrayal, let me know in the comments. How would you handle finding a secret life after 15 years? And if you haven't already, subscribe to Kin Justice Chronicles so you don't miss the moment Sarah turns the tables. For the next 4 months, I became the finest actress the world had never seen. Living with Julian was like walking through a minefield pretending I was strolling through a meadow. Every morning, I would wake up, kiss the man who had stolen 15 years of my life, and ask him how he wanted his coffee. I watched him across the breakfast table, studying the way he adjusted his tie, the way he checked his watch, the micro movements of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was still the gold standard, still the man the neighbors envied, still the architect designing grand visions for the future. But while he was busy planning the structural integrity of skyscrapers, I was in our basement at night, mapping out the structural failure of his life. I began the audit. Since Julian had convinced me long ago to let him handle our complex finances, I had to be careful. I started by looking for the paper trail of my inheritance. My grandmother's estate had been significant, nearly $700,000, intended to be the bedrock of our family. Julian had moved it into what he called a diversified portfolio. In reality, I discovered he had moved it into several shell companies that eventually paid the mortgage on a charming little house in that quiet suburb. He wasn't just cheating on me, he was making me pay for his second home. He was using my dead grandmother's legacy to buy toys for a child that wasn't mine and silk blouses for a woman that didn't know I existed. The coldness that settled in my chest wasn't just anger, it was a profound, crystalline sense of purpose. I started making my own moves. I reached out to a forensic accountant under the guise of estate planning for my art studio. Behind the scenes, we began to untangle the web. Every time Julian went on his business trip, I was in a glass-walled office downtown signing papers.
That slowly, legally redirected the flow of those shell companies back into an account he couldn't touch. I didn't want to just take my money back. I wanted to leave him with the debt he had created. I found out he had taken out a second mortgage on our Victorian home to fund a commercial investment that turned out to be a trust fund for his secret daughter. I didn't stop him. In fact, I encouraged him to expand his horizons. I wanted the debt to be so high that when the truth came out, there would be no safety net left for him to fall into. The psychological toll was a slow-burning fever. There were nights when he would reach for me in the dark, and I would have to grit my teeth to keep from screaming. He would whisper about our wedding, about how he couldn't wait to finally call me his wife, and I would realize that in his twisted mind, he probably thought he loved me. He thought he could have both, the prestige of the gold standard wife and the comfort of the shadow family. He thought he was the architect of two separate buildings, never realizing they shared the same foundation. I started to meet the woman from the photos, not in person, but through her digital life. Her name was Martha. She was a kindergarten teacher. She posted photos of Jules taking their daughter to the park, calling him the hardest working man she knew. She was a victim too. She was living in a dream built on stolen money and borrowed time. As the wedding grew closer, the pressure became an atmospheric weight. The invitations were sent, heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold foil. 200 of the most influential people in Julian's world, his partners, his wealthy clients, his dignified parents. I watched him handwrite the addresses, his penmanship perfect and steady. He was so proud of the spectacle he was creating. I let him pick the flowers, the 5-course menu, the vintage champagne that cost $200 a bottle. I let him spend every cent of his bonus on the optics of perfection. Every dollar he spent on the wedding was a dollar he wouldn't have for his defense lawyers later. I was a ghost in my own house, a silent witness to a man building his own gallows. I remember the final fitting for my dress. I stood in front of the mirror, the white lace draped over me like a shroud. The seamstress was gushing about how beautiful I looked, how Julian was going to lose his breath when he saw me. I looked at my reflection and didn't see a bride. I saw a reckoning. I had the ledger, I had the bank statements, I had the photos from Unit 402, and most importantly, I had the video that had arrived on my phone just days before. A video sent by a disgruntled former assistant of Julian's who had finally seen through the cracks. It showed Julian and Martha at a birthday party, Julian blowing out candles and promising a forever that didn't include me. This is where the story shifts from a tragedy to a cold, calculated strike. If you're waiting for the moment the veil drops, you're not alone. Comment justice if you think Sarah is doing the right thing by waiting for the wedding day. And if you're new to Kin Justice Chronicles, subscribe now. We are moving into the final hour where the wedding bells become a fire alarm. The hours leading up to the ceremony were a blur of champagne toasts and nervous laughter from my bridesmaids. They kept telling me how lucky I was, how Julian had been calling all morning to make sure the lilies were the exact shade of white I liked. I smiled, I nodded, and I tucked the flash drive, the one containing the architecture of his ruin, into the garter on my right leg. By the time the limousine arrived to take us to the church, the air felt electric, like the moment right before a lightning strike. I stood in the vestibule of the church, the scent of old wood and expensive incense filling my lungs, listening to the muffled roar of 200 people in the pews. These were the people Julian lived to impress: the senior partners, the city council members, the high society donors. His entire reputation was a glass house, and they were all sitting inside it. I reached the altar, and he took my hands. His palms were slightly damp, the only sign that he was anything less than a machine. The priest began the service, the ancient words about honor and faithfulness hanging in the air like a bad joke. Julian looked at me with such intensity, such practiced devotion, that I almost admired the sheer scale of his sociopathy. He had spent 15 years building this moment, the ultimate coronation of his double life. When the priest finally reached the part about, if anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be wed, the silence in the church was absolute. I felt the weight of the flash drive against my skin. This was the moment. The room was waiting for me to say, I do. Instead, I let go of his hands. I turned to the audience, my voice steady and cold, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply thanked everyone for coming to witness the end of a 15-year lie. I saw Julian's confusion ripple into a sudden, sharp panic. I walked to the front pew where the church's media coordinator was sitting, and I handed him the drive. I told him to press play on the tribute video Julian had prepared for the reception. But the screen didn't show photos of our vacations or our first home. It showed the interior of Unit 402. It showed the bank statements of my stolen inheritance. And then it showed the video of Julian blowing out the candles on a birthday cake in a small house in the suburbs, promising Martha a forever that he was currently trying to sell to me. The sound that erupted in that church wasn't a gasp. It was a collective intake of breath so sharp it felt like the room had lost its oxygen. I turned back to Julian. His face had gone a shade of gray I didn't know was humanly possible. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered. In front of his parents, his partners, and his world, he wasn't the architect of the century, he was a thief and a fraud. I didn't wait for his explanation. I didn't wait for the priest to dismiss us. I took off the 5-carat past, present, and future ring, dropped it onto the marble floor, and walked back down the aisle. I walked past the shocked faces, past the whispering, and through the oak doors into the bright, honest sunlight. For the first time in 15 years, I could breathe. The kin justice was complete. I had lost a decade and a half, but I had regained my soul, and I had left the architect standing in the rubble of a house he had no idea how to rebuild. The wedding bells stopped, but the fallout has just begun. Julian is left with the debt, the public shame, and a legal battle he can't win. Please hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for the final aftermath of the 15-year lie. The aftermath of the wedding wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, agonizing collapse of everything Julian had ever built. As I walked out of that church and into the back seat of a waiting car, one I had paid for with a private account he didn't even know existed, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that inside those oak doors, the life of Julian Vance was being dismantled in real time. By the time I reached the hotel to strip off the lace and silk that felt like a straitjacket, the first of the phone calls began. Not to me, but to him. His senior partners, men who valued reputation and integrity above all else, didn't even wait for the sun to set before they began the process of scrubbing his name from the firm's brass plaque. You see, in the world Julian lived in, you can be a shark, but you cannot be a fool. And I had made him look like the biggest fool in the city. The next 6 months were a masterclass in what I call kin justice. While Julian was hiding in a rented apartment, watched by the woman he had also betrayed, because Martha, the mother of his child, had seen the news too, I was sitting in a sun-drenched office with a legal team that moved like a surgical unit.
Because I had waited, because I had funneled the shell companies back into my name while he was distracted by wedding cake tastings, the diversified portfolio he had built with my inheritance was legally frozen. He tried to claim I was vindictive, tried to tell the court I was mentally unstable, but the digital trail I had spent 4 months documenting was undeniable. Every dollar he had spent on Unit 402, every flight to Dubai that never happened, every gift he had bought for his shadow life was presented as evidence of financial fraud and marital misconduct. He wasn't just losing a wife, he was losing the very ground he stood on. I remember the day of our final settlement hearing. Julian walked into the room, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw the true architecture of the man without the facade. He looked small. The custom suits were gone, replaced by something off the rack that didn't quite fit. The confidence, that gold standard shimmer, had been replaced by a frantic, hollow desperation. He tried to look me in the eye, tried to use that old, deep-voiced charm to ask for a private word. I didn't even acknowledge his presence. To me, he was a ghost, a character from a book I had finally finished reading. When the judge ruled that the Victorian home was to be sold, with 100% of the equity returning to me to settle the inheritance debt, Julian put his hands in his hands. He had built 2 houses, and now he was homeless in both. But the real justice wasn't the money, it was the silence. Julian had spent 15 years being the center of everyone's universe. Now he was a pariah. His parents, dignified people who couldn't bear the stain of the public scandal, stopped answering his calls. His influential friends disappeared like smoke in a gale. He was left with the one thing he feared most, the truth of who he was when no one was watching. Martha, to her credit, took her daughter and moved 3 states away. She didn't want a cent of the guilt money he had stolen from me. She realized, as I did, that a man who builds his life on a lie will eventually run out of bricks. Now, it is 1 year since that day at the altar. I am standing in a different kind of space, a high-ceilinged warehouse loft that smells of turpentine, linseed oil, and hope. This is my studio. It isn't a gold standard mansion in the suburbs, and it doesn't have a professional gardener, but every inch of it belongs to me. I spent the last 12 months traveling, not to cities Julian designed, but to places he would never go. I went to the rugged coasts of Ireland and the quiet temples of Japan. I learned to listen to my own intuition again, to trust the voice that I had suppressed for 15 years. I realized that the shield Julian had provided was actually a blindfold. Without it, the world is much bigger, much brighter, and infinitely more honest. I recently heard through a mutual acquaintance that Julian is working for a mid-level firm in a city where no one knows his name. He lives in a small studio apartment and spends his weekends in mediation hearings, trying to get supervised visitation with a daughter who barely remembers him. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that silver key, number 402. I keep it in a small box on my desk as a reminder. It's a reminder that the most beautiful structures can be built on the most rotten foundations. It's a reminder that justice isn't just about winning a court case, it's about reclaiming your own narrative. 15 years felt like a lifetime when I was in the middle of it. Now it feels like a very expensive education. I didn't lose 15 years. I bought the rest of my life. I look at the canvas in front of me, a sprawling, chaotic, beautiful piece of art that Julian would have hated because it's not orderly. I pick up my brush and I realize that for the first time, I am the architect, and this time I'm building something that can never be torn down because it's built on the absolute, unshakable truth. This concludes the 15-year lie of Sarah and Julian Vance. But for Kin Justice Chronicles, this is just the foundation. If you've stayed with us through these long minutes of betrayal and reclamation, you are the reason this channel exists, no matter how long it takes to find it. Comment "Reborn" if you've ever had to start over from the rubble of a lie. Please subscribe, hit the bell, and remember, in the end, every secret finds its way to the light. Thank you for being part of the justice.